Hello, and welcome to Breast Cancer Conversations, a podcast brought to you by survivingbreastcancer.org. I am Laura Carfang, breast cancer survivor and founder of survivingbreastcancer.org, a nonprofit organization providing community, education, and resources to empower those diagnosed with breast cancer and their caregivers from day one and beyond. Hello, my friends, and welcome to another episode of Breast Cancer Conversations. When you hear the words clinical trial, what comes to mind? For many people, it can feel intimidating. Maybe you picture experimental treatments, being a guinea pig, or something that's only being offered when all other options have been exhausted. But the truth is, clinical trials are responsible for nearly every advancement we've seen in breast cancer treatment over the past several decades. From targeted therapies and immunotherapies to treatment de-escalation and personalized medicine, today's standard of care exists because patients choose to participate in research. Joining me today is Dr. Ada Wax, a breast medical oncologist and clinical investigator at Dana-Farber Cancer Institute, where she cares for patients while also designing and leading clinical trials that are helping shape the future of breast cancer treatment. Dr. Wax also helps oversee Dana-Farber's breast oncology clinical trials program, giving her a unique perspective on both patient care and the research that drives innovation. In this conversation, we break down everything you've ever wanted to know about clinical trials. What are the different phases? How are we as patients protected? How do you find a clinical trial? And perhaps most importantly, when should you start asking your care team about clinical trial opportunities? Whether you're newly diagnosed, living with metastatic breast cancer, or supporting someone you love, this episode will help you better understand how research is changing breast cancer care and how every patient can become a more informed partner in their treatment decisions. Welcome to the conversation.
My name is Dr. Ada Wax. I'm a breast medical oncologist at Dana-Farber Cancer Institute here in Boston. And at Dana-Farber, I spend about half of my time seeing patients with breast cancer, all different phases and types of breast cancer. And then I spend the other half of my time as a researcher. And a lot of what the research that I do is developing clinical trials and running clinical trials. And I also help to oversee our clinical trials program within breast oncology at Dana-Farber, working together with my colleague, Dr. Erica Mayer. So I spend a lot of time talking to patients about clinical trials, working on developing new clinical trials and trying to get them to patients and trying to make sure that clinical trials are running smoothly sort of across our breast cancer group. So I'm happy to be here. It's one of my favorite topics. Thank you for having me.
I was about to say, I'm so excited. We have the person to talk to about all things clinical trial. So very excited. Thank you for making the time. Tell me a little bit about what made you first interested in this type of research, getting into clinical trials.
Gosh, I mean,
taking you way back.
Yeah. It's so important and meaningful to take care of patients with breast cancer and try to give each patient the absolute best treatment possible for his or her cancer. But at the same time, it's always so evident when we're having those conversations and selecting those treatments that there's a lot better that we can do. We're privileged in breast cancer to have a lot of good biomarkers and a lot of good medicines, but also we can clearly do a lot better, for our patients all across the cancer spectrum. We need to do a better job of having better medicines, more effective medicines for patients who need them, and also figuring out who are the patients who could do really well with less than we currently give them. And so, that's what got me excited at the beginning, I guess, about not just taking care of patients, but trying to also do clinical trials because it's so exciting and so rewarding, not just to say okay, we can give you good treatment for this breast cancer, but we're also working on trying to make the treatments even better. That may mean less, that may mean more, but we're trying to make the treatments even better. And here are some ideas that we're excited about and ways that they might be helpful to you. So I like working at the junction of clinical care and clinical trials because you get to do both of those things.
That's awesome. I love that. I was trying to think back when I first heard the term clinical trials. This is definitely your day to day, every day you're talking about it. It's top of mind. But for someone like myself, I was diagnosed with breast cancer, and I'll talk a little bit about my story approaching actually at the time of this recording, my 10-year mark, which is coming up, which I'm really excited about. And the advancements of what has happened in medicine, in breast care, in breast treatment options. And I feel like an old lady of like, oh my God, they don't even like have my regimen anymore. Like those are like so no longer the guidelines, which I think is really exciting to hear how treatments continue to get better. But I think in my circles, like with my family and stuff, that's how it was talked about. It was always about like the medicine is getting better, the treatments are getting better, et cetera. I didn't necessarily know that was because of the clinical trial work that was happening behind the scenes, right? Like we didn't really use the term. I didn't know what a clinical trial was. I didn't know if it was something that was accessible to me or other people in our community. And so I would just love to kind of understand, if you take me from like a very novice learner here, of what is a clinical trial and the different phases. Is it a phase 1? Is it a phase 2? When do we go from like the laboratory to like the animal testing to the human testing or those types of things?
Yeah. No, great question. And you're right, because obviously there's this excitement about an understanding of, for most patients, like, yeah, our medicines are getting better every year and our guidelines are getting better and we have new options. But yes, behind that is actually a ton of patients who are participating in clinical trials. And so
Right.
what a clinical trial is, the most common type of clinical trial that we talk about in breast cancer is developing a new treatment or a new treatment approach. And so, often that means that we have a new drug or medicine. It doesn't have to be a drug, it could be a vaccine, for example, but, a new medication. And we want to see if it's better than the existing standard. We want to do a test, a trial, a very, very controlled experiment to understand which is better than the other. Uh, There are, of course, and I'll focus mostly on that type of clinical trial where we're developing new therapies. There are, of course, really important clinical trials that look at totally different things, like how can we better control nausea? Do we have a new medicine to control nausea? Are there questionnaires that we can help give
Mm.
patients, or apps on a mobile phone that we can give patients that help them report and control symptoms better and improve quality of life? Those are incredibly important types of clinical trials as well, but not the ones that I'll focus on here because we probably don't have a million hours.
Yes.
And so, just to say there are really important, like non-treatment clinical trials, but not exactly what I'm going to focus on. So generally, the way that a clinical trial works when we're testing a new treatment or a new treatment approach is that there's been some laboratory-based work done by some laboratory scientists who have decided, like, this is a pathway that's important in breast cancer and it hasn't gotten enough attention, or we haven't had a drug for it to date. And they develop this new drug or medicine in a lab. And that's called preclinical, meaning that's work
Mm.
that's done to understand why we might want to target this pathway in the lab, but before bringing it into the clinic, preclinical. And then if that looks promising enough in the laboratory setting, then we'll start a phase 1 clinical trial. So the first phase of clinical trials are phase 1 trials. Phase 1 trials are usually small trials, like maybe 20 patients or something like that, and are giving us information about the safety of a
Mm.
new medication. And I do always pause here and say that most clinical trials, or many phase 1 clinical trials, really are testing a brand new medicine. Like it used to be in the lab, and now we have to bring it into patients and test it in a really, really careful, safely monitored way to see if it's safe in patients and also get a little inkling of does it work in patients. So there are a lot of phase 1 trials that really are brand new medicines where we're testing different doses and looking at their safety. But it's important to realize there are lots of other types of phase 1 trials too. And some phase 1 trials are just two established, well-known, like old medicines being combined with each other for the first time. Because you always have to test safety when you're combining two medicines, for example, or it's a really well-established medicine with an additional medicine added to it, for example. And so I just always put that asterisk around phase 1 trials, because I do think that it's really easy when you hear this is a phase 1 trial to immediately think like, oh my God, yesterday a mouse got the drug and today I'm going to get this drug. And that is obviously very scary and uncomfortable a lot of the time. And some phase 1 trials do work like that. But some phase 1 trials are actually really well-established drugs, again, just being combined for the first time or something like that. So
Yeah.
when you hear phase 1 trial, it's important to ask your doctor, tell me why it's a phase 1 trial. Is it a new medicine? Is it a new combination? What are we testing the safety of in this phase 1 trial? But generally, a phase 1 trial is the earliest clinical investigation, and it's a small number of patients, and we're primarily looking at safety. Then a phase 2 clinical trial. So if a drug or a set of drugs looks good in a phase 1 clinical trial, it will move on to phase 2. A phase 2 clinical trial is usually a bit bigger, like maybe 80 to 100 patients, maybe 50 patients, something like that. And a phase 2 clinical trial is trying to get an initial assessment of the effectiveness of a new drug or a new set of drugs, a new treatment approach. And often a phase 2 trial will be what's called single arm. So it's not randomized, like you just get the treatment. We're treating 60 patients, 80 patients to see, does this medicine control their cancer or not? And in some cases, a phase 2 trial, it will be randomized, but still, pretty small, just like a few, 40 patients or something in each group. But basically, the goal of a phase 2 trial is to get an initial sense of the effectiveness of a new drug or a new treatment approach. And then if a new regimen, a new set of medicines is effective in a phase 2 trial, it will go on to a phase 3 trial. And a phase 3 trial in breast cancer, by definition, is always a randomized trial. So phase 3 trial is always a head-to-head comparison. I have my established old treatment that's in the current guidelines and in the current, FDA approval. And then I have a new regimen, a new set of treatments that I think looks potentially better than the old one. That's why I've gotten this far in my investigations. And in my phase 3 trial, I'm comparing them head to head to see which is the winner. And in this case, if the new option is the winner and we show, as we always hope to show, that it's better than the old option, then that new treatment approach would go on and be considered for FDA approval, insurance authorization, get into national guidelines and become the new standard of care, basically displacing whatever it was compared to. So by definition, a phase 3 trial will be randomized. And that's always important to talk to your doctor about and understand, what are my chances of getting in this group of the trial? My chances of getting in that group? Is it 50-50? How should I feel about both of the, the different groups? Because that's an uncomfortable thing, to not know which treatment you're going to get. And that's important to talk through when you're considering a phase 3 trial specifically. So that's sort of the gamut of the trial.
I really appreciate that breakdown. And even just talking about terminology here, those head-to-head trials, randomized trials. Where does the term blind or double-blind trial fit in? Is that part of the randomized? You either know, you don't know, or am I conflating terms here?
Randomized trials can be blinded, but they don't have to be blinded. And I would say in breast cancer, we see a lot of both types of trials. So there are some randomized trials that are not blinded. The patient knows, the doctor knows which treatment they're getting from the very beginning. They don't get to pick because it's a randomization, but they know as soon as the computer tells them which arm are they on, they know from day one which medicine or medicines they're getting. So there are plenty of randomized trials that are not blinded. However, there are some randomized trials that are blinded, meaning, and usually they're double blind, meaning both the patient and the doctor and the treating team are blind to which treatment group they were allocated to, they were assigned to. And what that means basically is everybody knows at the outset when the patient signs up for the trial that they have a chance of getting in one or the other group and they have no control over that. But the doctor and the patient don't know which group they get assigned to. And so that's blinding. So you're getting a treatment. There are no trials in breast cancer because our treatments are so good where you get nothing compared to something. So you're always getting, regimen A or regimen B. Yeah. But, some trials use special pills that are the same shape and size, and each group gets 2 pills and they're the same shape and size in both groups. So you don't know which pill is real and which pill is not real, basically. And that's a blinded trial. So it's randomized, but also blinded. So you don't know which group you're in.
Excellent. And when designing trials, can you tell me a little bit more, elaborate a little bit more when you would choose a blind trial versus not? Are there pros and cons or just different endpoints that researchers are looking for?
So the blinded trials would be always large randomized phase 3 trials. And those would always be run by drug companies, almost always be run by drug companies. I'm trying to think if there's an exception to that, but I don't think so. In breast cancer, blinded trials would always be run by drug companies. And the reason that they would choose to blind the patients and the doctors is just to absolutely positively eliminate as much as possible the likelihood that the patient or the doctor's perception of which group they're in would impact the outcome of that treatment. Because the whole point of randomizing patients is that you end up with two exactly equal groups that you can then compare and know that the only difference between them is whether they got medicine A or medicine B. That's the point of randomization. If the trial is blinded and randomized, then you can say the difference between them is not just that they got is just that they got medicine A or medicine B, and I can be extra certain of that because they didn't even know which one they were getting. You could
Right.
sort of imagine that maybe a scenario would come up where patients who were getting an experimental treatment, say, and they were really excited about it and they knew that's what they were getting, maybe they'd be more likely to stay on, say, for longer, even if they had side effects or symptoms that they didn't like or something, because they know that that's the treatment they're getting and they're so excited about it. So maybe if you don't blind the patients and the doctors to which group they're in, then the then the groups are different and the patients are more or less motivated to stay on a given treatment because they know it's the experimental drug. So that's
Yeah.
blinding is trying to get rid of that variable.
Yeah.
But, it's still tough even in a blinded trial, I will say, because usually you know what medicine you're getting, just because you're taking it and you're experiencing it. So even if you're
Right.
taking 2 pills and they look the same as the pills in the other group, based on these side effects or those side effects, often a patient can tell, but it's meant to try to get away from that.
Thank you for that deep dive. I think we're moving away from the I would say the historical view that clinical trials were like that last resort opportunity for patients when all of our standard of care treatments have ended. That's when like, oh, maybe I'll start looking at clinical trials. But now we're hearing more that, people can start, first line treatments even with clinical trial options. I would love to hear your experience and when you're talking to patients or when patients can feel empowered to bring these up with their doctors. When's a good time and how do we do that?
Yeah, great question. And I couldn't agree more with you that I think patients often, when a doctor mentions the word or phrase clinical trials, immediately feel sort of maybe discouraged or nervous. Like, oh,
Right.
if we're talking about clinical trials, like things must be really dire, like I must have no good options. And like you said, that could not be farther from the truth. Absolutely. There are some clinical trials that are looking at new drugs and we're looking at them for patients where, other good options don't exist or aren't as attractive. But actually, most clinical trials are not that. Most clinical
Mhm.
trials are saying, we think we can do better than the standard. Our goal is always to do better than the standard. We can do better than the standard for your first treatment, for your second treatment, for your third treatment. And so I always see clinical trial participation, of course, I'm hugely biased, as a source of hope. Like you can be part of solving this problem. We have good medicines, but we might be able to get better medicines at every step of the way. So yes, I think that's a really important, sort of emotional response
Yes.
to
Mhm.
try to uh, talk yourself out of when you feel that, like, oh, clinical trials, that feels negative to me. Like, actually, it's a source of hope, and it's how we are moving things forward
Yes.
all along the spectrum of breast cancer care. But anyway, to answer your question, when should you consider a clinical trial? So my intro, as my statement sort of implies, really anytime. It's always a good time to ask your doctor, are there clinical trials that I should think about that might be right for me at this point? Help me understand what new things are being developed in my cancer subtype and my cancer stage. And do you think I should try to get access to them? And how might I do that? Those are always good questions to ask. In general, the most common time you would enroll on a clinical trial that's looking at a different type or a newer type of treatment is when you're making a treatment decision.
Mm.
So if you have a metastatic breast cancer, that means when you're starting a new therapy, when you're switching to the next therapy, times like that. If you have an early stage breast cancer and you're making a decision about getting a chemo or an anti-estrogen pill or medicines like that, either before surgery or after surgery, in that early conversation where you're saying, your doctor saying, okay, we could, pick option A or pick option B, and these are the side effects of A and these are the side effects of B, that's when you could say, all right, is there an option C? That would be a clinical trial that's right for me here.
Yes. That's a really good point too. Do you see, or maybe I'm not sure how to phrase the question, do you see more trials in a metastatic setting than in an early stage breast cancer setting, or are there trials happening kind of equally across the stages of breast cancer?
It's a great question, but no, they're all across. There's no preference
Okay.
in any direction. So there's lots of trials going on for preoperative treatments. There's
Mm.
lots of trials going on for post-operative treatments for patients who have early stage breast cancers. There's lots of trials going on for patients with metastatic breast cancer to pick the first, the second, the third.
That's great to hear. So regardless your stage of breast cancer, clinical trials are a valid option for people and they can have those conversations with their doctors to inquire.
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely.
And I also hear patients willing to travel for clinical trials. So depending on where people are being treated, you are at Dana-Farber, which I know runs a lot of wonderful research and trials, and people will travel here to Boston to participate on these trials. And so can you talk to me a little bit about what the process tends to be like for recruiting for trials? And then I guess the likelihood, right, if you're being seen somewhere where your hospital has clinical trials, you might have easier access to get into them because it's where you are. But if you're not at a center that has clinical trials, being able to find them elsewhere. Can you talk to me a little bit about just like how you guys recruit and then how patients can actually start to look for these resources as well?
It's a great question. And it is an unfortunate truth that many clinical trials, they do require you to get not necessarily all, but most of your treatment at the center that's running the trial, because there is this extra safety monitoring, extra oversight because it's a new drug or new approach to treatment. And so because of that extra monitoring and oversight, a lot of the treatment does get administered at the sort of specialty center, which is really unfortunate, honestly, because it means that there's large geographic areas of the country where this is harder to access because of the commute. It just becomes infeasible. So, as a clinical research community, that's something that we're trying hard to think through, how to make sure that the data we get is high quality and we're really doing all the monitoring we need to be doing, but at the same time, making trials accessible to broader populations is a really important, goal for all of clinical research. So I would say for patients who are interested in clinical trials, the best, whether they're here in Boston, at Dana-Farber, or somewhere incredibly far away, doesn't matter where throughout the United States, the best first resource is your oncologist and your treating team. And just talk to that person about, is this a time that I should consider clinical trials? Even if I don't necessarily want to do that right now, can you just tell me about what might be available for a time in the future when it is something that I want to consider? And your doctor will probably be the best first point of contact and help you do the first sort of triage of what drugs and what new treatment approaches are under investigation here.
Okay.
Because the truth is, so I would always say, speak with your oncologist first to get their initial take on it. The truth is, there are plenty of websites that have lists of clinical trials for breast cancer, and patients can try to access those themselves and certainly can access those themselves. There are some sites, although the URLs are escaping me, specifically for metastatic breast cancer patients looking for clinical trials. There's the national database called clinicaltrials.gov, which is a federally funded database that every single clinical trial in the United States gets deposited into. So there are online resources that patients can absolutely use to look up clinical trials. But the truth is that the scope of the options is so huge. And there's so much minutia in terms of, you have to be this stage of cancer and this subtype of cancer and gotten these prior treatments and this many years have passed, things like that, that it can be incredibly difficult to sort through without some at least initial pass by your doctor at, okay, these are the types of trials you might want to be thinking about. So that's why I always think talking to your oncologist, wherever you are in the country, is a good first step.
I'm so glad you mentioned that because these websites are so overwhelming that I don't know why I wouldn't even think to do that. Of course, I think so much of us are like, oh, I have access to the computer, the internet. Let me just Google and try and find something myself. But that is so burdensome too. So if I could just ask my doctor, hey, I'm considering this, or at least want to know what my options are, because this is the world that you guys live in. It's probably top of mind to be these are the ones that are currently actively seeking recruitment or that you would be a good fit for. So maybe just opening that door and having that conversation to say, hey, I'm interested, keep me in mind for the future if there's opportunities.
Exactly.
So having that conversation and really being a team and a partner with your medical team to put together that care plan. I love that. I also think that leads into a conversation of developing those relationships and building trust with the doctors and the scientists, especially around clinical trials. I think there tends to still be a lot of fear around participating, but I think you also talked a little bit about these different phases, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, and really being able to ask questions. I'm getting the support. People are going to be looking after me. We're going to be tracking the symptoms. You're actually probably getting even better care on a clinical trial to some extent with so many eyes on you than just going through the infusion center otherwise, I could imagine.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely true. Now, of course, we try to keep a very close eye on and be very, proactive about any issues arising for all of our patients. But
Of
when
course.
you're on a clinical trial, because it's a newer approach by definition, even if it's old drugs, it's a new approach in some way.
Mm-hmm.
And so yes, there's always a research nurse who gets added to the treatment team when you're on a clinical trial. That's true across the country and across the board. And so there's like literally that additional set of eyes who's looking at what's happening to you. It's an additional sort of point of contact by phone or portal message if issues are arising. So there's that additional member added to the clinical treatment team that's patient facing. And then there's a whole bunch of other, a whole huge team in the background that are making sure for each clinical trial that we're collecting all the data that we need to understand, is it safe for a given patient and is it effective for a given patient? So it is this huge infrastructure that exists to make sure that we are really understanding if a drug is working and if it's safe.
I want to take a quick moment and tell you something I'm really excited about. You can now download the survivingbreastcancer.org app directly from the App Store or Google Play. Just search for survivingbreastcancer.org. It is completely free to download, and inside you will have access to all of our support groups, educational programs and webinars, all of our blog content and articles, podcast episodes, and community features to connect with others who understand what you're going through. Everything in one place, because navigating breast cancer shouldn't require 15 open browser tabs. Download the app today. Another question I have about clinical trials, because we know in general when you're diagnosed with breast cancer and you're going through treatment, having access to support systems is really important. And so I'm curious, in a clinical trial setting, and let's use just a randomized but not blind. So like you kind of know which arm you're on and what you're getting. Do the patients ever get to know each other as a patient cohort going through a clinical trial to build that camaraderie and support system? Maybe that's just wishful thinking. I don't know if that's a thing that people do.
I could say yes, but all the patient confidentiality rules still apply. And actually they're like, there's like an extra tier of patient sort of confidentiality protection because you are, part of what you're consenting when you consent to a clinical trial is that then your data is not just in the medical record, it's also in a clinical trial database because you have to have this whole parallel way of tracking very, very granularly how is every patient doing, what side effects are they experiencing, et cetera. So there's actually extra care taken for patients on a clinical trial in order to offset that to maintain confidentiality. So we cannot.
So absolutely not.
We could never share the sort of like, we could never create a cohort of patients on a clinical trial. Now, I'm absolutely positive, and I think that this is a good thing, that does happen in like patient discussion forums,
Okay.
I have plenty of patients who tell me, that they are in a Facebook, they're on XYZ clinical trial, they're in a Facebook group for patients who are on this new drug, and they're talking in that forum about their side effects and what's worked for them to manage.
That's more patient driven, not coming from
patient driven. Yeah, exactly. So I'm glad that exists and that patients form that. I think that makes a lot of sense, but it can never be driven by the trial.
Yeah. And I think that's a really good point too, to kind of bring up the level of safety and confidentiality that you guys are maintaining on these clinical trials. And especially in this time, this era where everyone is so concerned about their own personal data. And so when you're explaining to patients, what the trial is and how the protections and precautions are being implemented, can you talk to me a little bit about that patient consent piece of getting onto a clinical trial and making sure that the patient understands everything that they're signing up for?
Yeah, it's incredibly important. And it's a process that I think I've grown to respect like even more as I've done this for more and more and more years, because we produce and we painstakingly go over with our patients these like 20 to 30 to 50 page informed consent documents, which are huge. Again, like your initial reaction is like, oh my God, this is so overwhelming. But it really is it's so, so, so important to have all that information laid out for our patients and to go through it with them in as much detail as they want and to give them time to take it in as much detail as they want. So yes, part of going on to enrolling on any clinical trial is an informed consent process. And this, by the way, is true of participating in any research at all. Like even to draw one tube of blood from a patient that is extra on top of their usual tubes of blood and could possibly be used in the future to ask a question about, who knows, anything. Even that one tube of blood, there has to be an informed consent process before any investigator, any researcher could ever take even like that one tube of blood or even use leftover blood for a research question. So there's an informed consent process before all research, but it's particularly in depth, of course, before going on a clinical trial, because that's really changing and investigating a new approach to treatment. So yes, we always go over, before we would do any research processes with any patient, we always go over this very, very long informed consent document that talks about not just like what treatment might you be getting and what might the side effects be, which is obviously super important, but everything you just touched on, like, well, how does this affect your confidentiality? Like now you are in a different, your information's in a separate place, not just the medical record, but a separate database. How are we protecting that? How are we de-identifying you? Whom should you contact if you have concerns, if you have questions, if you think that something you experience is unexpected? How much of your time are we going to take? Clinical trials, they pretty much always take some extra time from patients, unfortunately. So we want to be very upfront about normally you might come in once a month, but for this trial, you have to come in 3 times a month. That's part of the informed consent process because we need to inform patients about what they're getting into and what we're going to be asking of them, and then make sure that they're still in agreement. And that's documented, very formally with signatures from both parties and then printed and given to the patient. And that's a federally regulated process that's standardized across all research across the US. So it is a really long and overwhelming document, but it is incredibly.
And from the patient perspective too, just knowing that we're getting all of this information, and it can take a while to digest and process and understand. Yes, that I love, like, even just having this conversation with you, like, I'm getting excited about clinical trials. You're making it sound like this is like really great opportunity. We're being part of the process and really helping inform this next generation of treatments for patients that come behind us. As we wrap up this conversation, because I can totally see why this could go on for hours on so many different directions, and your enthusiasm for it, I'm curious, what is on the horizon? What is making you and keeping you so excited about the various trials that are happening currently and the direction of breast treatment? I know that's a very big open-ended question, but just like right now, like, what are we super excited about in your world?
Oh my goodness. Yes, there could be a whole separate treatise written about that. I mean, I think what I'm most excited about in a very, very broad way, across, again, subtypes, stages of breast cancer, is how we're slowly getting better and better, not just at developing new drugs, which is super important, but at figuring out how to individualize therapy. At the end of the day, I think that's really important to patients. Now, I'm not a patient, I'm a doctor, so you please disagree with me if you'd like, but I think that's really important. Most patients want a stronger drug, would accept a drug with more side effects if they know it's what they need. And most patients would want to not get a super toxic drug if they know that it's not what they need. And yet, we still end up in a lot of settings with sort of a one-size-fits-all approach to treatment. A 3 sizes fit all approach to treatment, maybe. Like, we have this, we have that, we have the next thing. We're choosing between those 3. But we'd love to be much more individualized and have some markers in the blood, in the tumor, whatever it is that can really tell us which is the right treatment for this patient. And I think that that's something I'm really excited about, is not just like the new drug development, which is so promising and exciting, but incorporating into the development of new drugs and, medicine combinations and things, figuring out which features of this person's tumor that we measured in the blood or in the tissue are telling us this is the right drug for them. And I think we are slowly getting better at that. And it's something that we need to keep working on. So that's something that I'm personally excited about, is treatment individualization, I guess, and really deploying that in a in a broader way.
I would totally agree. That's very exciting. I'm so happy to hear we're trending in that direction. From my personal experience, I can't speak for all patients either, but having something where it's individualized, knowing why it's working for me would be really motivating for me to maybe endure some of the toxicity or the side effects. And then also in our smaller just social breast cancer groups, I think we're always struggling with this. Why did some treatment work for me and not for you? Why is she progressing or had a recurrence and not these other people? And so there must be something underlying, because it's not like, oh, she ate more kale and I didn't have enough broccoli in my diet, right? So how do we get down to this point of what's really happening inside our bodies and really getting some answers to help us just feel comfortable in such an uncertain environment? So Dr. Wack, this has been an incredible conversation. And I really appreciate you taking the time to help educate me and our listeners and our viewers on clinical trials today. I hope you will consider coming back, as I know there's going to be many more questions, but it's been wonderful speaking with you today.
Thank you for having me.
And thank you, everyone, for listening to our show. I would like to acknowledge that all of the information on our podcast is from personal experiences and is not a substitute for professional medical advice. You should always contact your medical care team. If you are looking for specific topics or would like to be a guest on our show, please feel free to reach out. My email is laura@survivingbreastcancer.org. Our show is made possible by our nonprofit, survivingbreastcancer.org, and by our incredible donors like yourself. You can hop on over to survivingbreastcancer.org to sign up for our mailing list, make a donation, and explore the 400+ programs we offer each year at survivingbreastcancer.org/events. Until next time, keep on thriving.